Hi everybody, it's Jen and I'm the Unapologetic Reader. Today I'm here to do my June wrap-up, and as you can see, it was a very good month for reading. I read 16 books and I'm going to try to get to them as quickly as I can. If there are any books you want to hear more about, just leave me a comment and I can definitely do an independent review on one of those books. But for now, I think we better start breaking down this pile of books, don't you? So here we go. The first book I read was Hidden Figures by Margaret Lee Shetterly. I read this book after watching the movie, and I wouldn't suggest that you go into reading this book expecting it to kind of follow along the movie. The two are very different. I really enjoyed the story that was told in the movie, and I think it generated a lot of interest in what was going on during that time and this perspective of that history. This book gives you a lot more of the history of what was going on, which I really appreciated. I thought it was interesting. Also, if you're interested in kind of the history of flight and what NASA and the US were doing with all things flying and that sort of a deal, there's a lot of that in here, and I think fans of history of flight would just gobble that up. I liked the additional information that we got in this book. Once I stopped trying to pair this up with oh, okay, this must be this part in the movie, I had to just drop that because I was getting confused and losing track of things. I definitely think though that in comparing this book to the movie and some of the little moments that happened in here that were explored in the film, I think there was a missed opportunity. There's a very pivotal thing that happens in the book between the African American calculators in the lunchroom and the little card that is set out on the table of the lunchroom to sort of designate where they are supposed to sit, and more importantly make it clear where they are not allowed to sit. And something very powerful happens in the book around that, which was not even touched in the film. I understand the movie has limitations, but I think it really was a missed opportunity. So if you really kind of want the whole full in-depth story, I would definitely recommend giving this one a shot. If all you really want though is story and you're more interested in that and less interested in the history, you might want to skip this. It's very history heavy, and if that's just not what you're after, then I would suggest watching the movie. It kind of gives you the brief, surface of the history and what was going on, so you can at least talk about it. The book is going to go way more in depth. It's going to give you dates and a lot of background history of what was going on that sort of inspired a lot of the things that the US did and some of the choices that NASA made, and a lot of what made it possible for these women to move into a career field that before was not available to them. And I gave this book a 3 stars. The next book I read was Ashes of Twilight by Kassy Tayler. This is the first book in her Ashes trilogy, which is a steampunk dystopian. In this book, we are following Wren, and she and everyone she knows lives in this dome that is built on the surface of the earth, basically because they've been told that 200 years ago fire destroyed everything on the earth, and they have to stay in the dome because fire is still burning on the earth. Wren works for the miners, also called shiners, because they live underground under the city, under the dome, and basically are responsible for mining the coal that feeds the energy for the city and also keeps the powerful fans blowing to keep the air circulating so that it doesn't get too cloudy. Wren and her people are called shiners because they live pretty much their entire life underground, so they can see in the dark extremely well, but if light is shown on their eyes sort of shine. It's basically a development of her people over time living down there, how they've adapted so that they can see in pretty much almost constant dark all the time. This book was really good. I gave it a 4 stars. I was just stunned by how fast the story in this book took off. There is a surprise death in the first chapter, and it kind of made me pay attention and go, oh, okay, maybe this won't follow the normal setting of that. There is not a love triangle in this, which is a little bit surprising whenever reading young adult dystopian. There is, however, I wouldn't really call them love interests. Basically, there's a boy that Ren is interested in, and then there's a boy that everyone is sort of expecting her to end up with. And by everyone, I mean everyone like in her village. Like, it's just sort of expected. So this does play around with the themes of sort of other people's expectations of individuals, and when that kind of comes into conflict with what that individual might want herself, but yet also wants to, you know, be a good, responsible member of her community. And I thought that was really interesting to throw in here. Also, Ren takes care of this tiny little herd of blind ponies that they used to work in the mines, and I just really enjoyed reading the scenes between her and these blind ponies. It was kind of a nice break from all the heavy stuff that was going on, and showed her softer, gentler side, which was a clever way of adding some more depth to this character, who was raised in just this really brutal environment, who could have turned out pretty brutal and cold herself. A lot of times YA dystopians handle that through the main character having a sibling that they have to take care of, and I thought this was a new creative way of still accomplishing the same task, but with a different technique. The next book I read was Red Rising by Pierce Brown. I am very late to this party. This book was super hyped on BookTube when it came out, and I get a little leery of super hyped books. I'll pick them up if it really does sound interesting to me, but then a lot of the time I will wait until I read it. I'm a little bit disappointed in myself that I did wait that long, because I loved this. I gave this a solid 5 stars. I absolutely gobbled this up. This is one of the rare times when I did just pick up the first book in a series and didn't just buy the whole series, because I have a bad habit of doing that. If I think I'll read a series, I just kind of buy all the books that are out in the series, and I wish that I had the other books in the series. I'm definitely going to be picking it up. I thought probably one of the most interesting things about this book was the main character, Darrow. He goes through a pretty significant physical transformation, but it takes a little bit longer for his internal transformation to take place. And you kind of see him start to think internally and sort of mourn a little bit for the person that he used to be, once he starts realizing that he's changed and he crosses some lines that he's never going to be able to go back from. And I thought that was really powerful, and I suspected that was why this book took off and why it has such a strong following in the YA community. Obviously, I don't think that you need to be a teenager to enjoy YA fiction. I read a ton of it. I haven't been a teenager in a very long time, but it did take me back to, especially when I was 17 and 18 and kind of realized that I was going to be entering adulthood very soon, and that my teenage years were behind me, and I was going to change. I was already changing, and there is a little bit of a sense of loss once you realize that, and you realize that stage is behind you. And I think it's an extremely relatable theme going on, even though it is set in a sci-fi based world and there's a lot of fantastical elements going on around it. I think at its core it's a hugely relatable theme and was handled very well, and I'm very nervous for Darrow, but I'm dying to know what happens and how this all plays out. Also, it was interesting seeing the development of a leader set in sort of a training environment where the whole goal is to learn to be a leader. I think sometimes that's sort of skimmed over in books when we're following characters who will eventually end up being leaders. This really shone a microscope on that and sort of showed that not all leaders know how to be a leader at the beginning. Some very serious mistakes are made, and that almost made it more interesting. So if you are like I was last month and still one of the few people who had yet to read this book and wasn't sure if it was worth the hype or not, it's worth the hype. You should definitely pick it up. The next book I read was Born of Shadows by Sherrilyn Kenyon. This is the 4th book in her, I think it's called League of Assassins series. This is a sci-fi romance series. Very strange genre, but it's done extremely well. Sherrilyn Kenyon is one of my favorite authors. I really like her League of Assassins series so far. Obviously, if something's about assassins, that's usually enough to get me to pick this up just in and of itself. This book, the male main character is someone who we have seen in previous books. He's more of a side character, and he's very much a playboy. Always kind of has a different girl, or sometimes 2 or 3 different girls on his arm. And so I was really interested to see how his story would play out, because, you know, being that it is romance, the whole idea is, you know, the main character is going to find another person, male or female, and hook up with them, and basically that's going to be their one true love, and yada yada yada. So I was curious to see how she handled a character she had set up to be sort of a playboy, and make it believable that he would actually fall in love with one single character, and that would be it for him. Sherrilyn Kenyon did not disappoint. She definitely delivered on that promise. She also gave us a really good reason and motivation as to why the main character was the way that he was towards women and just about life in general. The female lead in this book comes from a planet and a species of people, I guess, for lack of a better term, who remind me a lot of the Amazons. You know, very female-centered. They pretty much only keep males around for breeding purposes, and often the fate that befalls those males is terrible. It's a very brutal, harsh environment, so it doesn't have all the sisterly and womanly love of the Amazons that we're familiar with, or probably more crucially at this point in time, that have been portrayed in the Wonder Woman movies. This was probably the perfect time to read that, because that parallel was almost impossible to miss, and it was very interesting. I love that Sherrilyn Kenyon does such a good job of writing these extremely strong, powerful female characters who she's one by one sort of pairing up with these very dark, powerful, brutal assassins, because I don't think it would be bought that a character who's a strong assassin would really find much interest in, you know, a soft, weak, sort of victimized female. You know, there has to be more than that there to keep them interested longer than like for a one-night stand kind of a thing. I loved the pacing in this. I am noticing now that this is 4 books into the series that there is a pattern in that so far in each book there's been at least one character who either is or sort of has been revealed as a royal, either in one of the planetary systems or in one of the species in this, and that might annoy some people. It doesn't annoy me. Whenever I read in the romance genre, we know that there's going to be a certain formula that is followed, and I just look for formulas that I enjoy reading, and I just expect and appreciate more and more and more of that. I also think it's a really interesting idea to play around with the idea of these very publicly visible characters who have a very high seat in politics, who are also assassins, so it's almost like they have to lead a dual life. It's kind of a flip on the superhero genre that circulates, where, you know, you've got the superhero, but then they have to lead a mild-mannered life in their public life. This is almost the exact opposite. It flips it around, so their non-super life is basically very public, very much in the public eye. They're these high-ranking individuals, and then when they're being assassins, it's almost like they have to keep it very low-key, you know, secret identities, that kind of a thing. And so I think that's what makes it interesting for me, is it's taking something very familiar, but it's flipping it, which is a very clever technique in writing. If I didn't say so before, I gave this a 5 stars. It's very rare I read one of Sherrilyn Kenyon's books that I don't give a 5 stars to. I highly recommend it. If you're turned off by the sexy times that are often found in romance books, I will say I think there was only like 1 or 2 sexy time scenes in this book, and they were pretty brief. They're handled very well. A lot of sexual tension, but it's definitely not one of those where every other page the characters are having sex with each other, so you don't need to worry about that. This is definitely sci-fi action based. There's political intrigue. That's kind of the main focus of this book. The next book I read was Prelude to Foundation by Isaac Asimov. You may remember from my previous wrap-up in May, I talked about the Foundation that I read and really liked it. I loved this one just as much. I gave it 5 stars as well. You can see I have quite a few pages that I've marked, and there were also more pages in here where I wrote, annotated, underlined in addition to that. I think it was really fun getting to know Harry Seldon sort of as a regular man before he became the Harry Seldon mythological legend in the later Foundation books. And we also got to see him and see him sort of struggle with his own doubts and misgivings before psychohistory really was a thing that he developed. We get to see him sort of be a normal person. He's paired up pretty early on with a female sort of bodyguard, which is really interesting, and she's a history teacher at a university. And Harry isn't really that much into history, though he sort of learns that that's going to be a component he will need to develop psychohistory. He's more of a philosopher. So listening to Harry and his bodyguard sort of have these long intellectual philosophical debates was really, really interesting and fascinating for me to read. I really enjoyed it. I think were we to jump universes and sort of dump Harry Seldon into the Harry Potter world, he would absolutely be a Ravenclaw, which is probably why I enjoy reading about him so much and seeing him sort of work his way through developing this. There were also some surprises in here. Some of them I kind of guessed, or I was halfway right, but it's always really fun to be surprised. I don't usually try to figure things out too much in advance. The next book I read was A Play of Shadows by Julie Sharneda. This is the second book in the Night's Edge duology for now. I gave this one 4 stars. I thought it was a very strong wrap-up to the duology. I loved returning to Merodell, which is the main village where the first book in the Night's Edge series took place. The first book, if you don't know or don't remember from my earlier video on this when I hauled this book, is called A Turn of Light. And basically it's this little village of Merodell, and our main character, Jen Nayland, she lives there, she's going about her life, and she's never been outside the village, and you sort of learn in that book that there's a specific reason why she has never left the village, and she actually cannot leave the village, or there will be very dire consequences. In A Play of Shadows, I was a little bit nervous because I noticed that the way that she's dressed on here is very, very different from the first book, and very, very different from the way people dress in the first book, and I was worried that it was more a marketing thing, and it's like, oh, well, they had to, sex her up a little bit because, obviously the first book must have done well, and they put out a second book, but that's not the case. There's actually a sort of loophole that is explored in this book that actually enables Jen to go and visit another city, which she just loathes the fact that she can't leave her village and can't go anywhere. So when she finally discovers a way to do it, her excitement is infectious. You can't help but be excited for her to go and do this, even though it's probably going to create a lot of trouble, and it's a very dangerous journey that she has to go through to get there, and there's a lot of things that could go wrong. I liked how we got to see more of this world. There was more of the politics that was brought into this as she sort of interacted with other people. Also, Jen's own powers really take a leap in this book, and it was just fascinating to see what happened because, even the other characters in the book who know a bit more about her gifts and abilities than she does, she's a very strange hybrid of several different things, so none of them really know exactly what she is or is not capable of, which can be frustrating when she's trying to figure out, what she's supposed to do, and, she goes to these people, and a lot of the time they're just like, we'll see. So I really enjoyed it. I thought this had a very satisfying ending to the story. There were a couple of breadcrumbs, however, that were dropped that make me think Sharneda hasn't completely left this world for good. I would certainly read more if she wrote more in this world. But overall, if you're looking for a nice, succinct duology, I would suggest picking up Night's Edge. The next book I read was Shadows of Glass by Kassy Tayler. This is the second book in her Ashes trilogy. As you can see, I couldn't wait very long before continuing on with this series. I only gave this one a 3 stars, however, this one dropped a little bit from the first book. I think part of the problem was the preview that I read on the back doesn't really do a good job of sort of setting up what this book is for. The main event that is sort of given away in the preview, I thought that's what the book was going to be about, and it actually didn't hit until like the last 2 or 3 pages of this book, so it made the whole pacing of the book feel off. It was very confusing for me. So if you do read the first book and you like that and then you pick up this one, I would just urge you to just go into it blind. Don't read the back of the book. For that reason, I'm not going to say what the preview says this book is about. Instead, we get to spend more time with Ren. We get to see her have to deal with some of the consequences of the choices she made in the first book. Also, a lot of the characters are very upset with her for those consequences, which is interesting because a lot of times in YA dystopian, you see the main character making these decisions that affect a lot of people, and everyone is just kind of like, oh, but it's okay, you're our hero, you're our savior, blah blah blah, whatever, even though she's really kind of completely turned their lives upside down. That doesn't happen in this one. There are a lot of people that are really upset because it's kind of like the things were fine the way they were, why'd you screw it up, and you didn't even bother to check with us first before you did that. So the main character definitely has had the rug pulled out from under her. She has a lot of self-doubt, and of course she's still very young, so she doesn't handle it in the most responsible way. I was pretty annoyed with the main character in a lot of this book. She meets a new boy and she sort of plays, you know, her main love interest and this other one off of each other in kind of a not very nice way. I really was frustrated with that and was worried that the whole book was going to be like that. Fortunately, however, one of the love interests really calls her out on it and basically says, this isn't okay the way that you're treating me, which is what would happen in real life, but doesn't happen in young adult fiction a lot. A lot of times the two love interests just kind of keep going along with it. It's like no one would put up with this in real life. Well, he doesn't, so it was very refreshing. One of the male characters in the first book, who she wasn't really interested in and was actually sort of very much against, in this book, as soon as another girl starts taking an interest in him, then she starts getting jealous. And that was a little bit frustrating too, and also annoying. I loved the airships, which make an appearance in this. They were really cool. I like that we got to spend a little bit of time on them and see how they work. It was good. I'm still going to finish the series. I have high hopes for the third book, but this one definitely struggled a little bit for me because of the pacing, because of all the stuff that our main character is trying to work through. But hopefully we have a strong finish to this series. The next book I read was Mechanica by Betsy Cornwell. This is a Cinderella retelling, and I loved it. Probably because it was very different from a lot of Cinderella retellings I have read. I'm sure you've heard this before, but let me just say, this is a Cinderella retelling where romance is not the main focus or the goal in this story. And it's not how it ends either. So I thought that was very brave of Betsy Cornwell to go off of. It absolutely worked. Mechanica is about Nick, short for Nicolette, which is our Cinderella character, if you will. She is an inventor. She is working out of her late mother's secret laboratory, dealing with her own ideas about inventions she wants to make, also building off of inventions that her own mother created. There's a lot of glass blowing in here, which was very interesting. I live in the Pacific Northwest, and there is a very big glass blowing art community near my area, and so that was really interesting to read about a character in a fantastical setting who does a lot of her own glass blowing and how the mechanics of that all work. Also a lot of fae in this story, but no fairy godmother. So everything you think you know about the Cinderella story is being flipped upside down on its head and turned around. Nick is a very strong female character. All she wants to do is make it on her own, not owe anything to anyone, and really be her own woman, which was, it's a very modern idea, and so it's interesting to see that thrown into sort of a fantastical realm with sort of an old fairy tale that we have a lot of preconceived notions about how that main character in that story is going to behave, and we actually see it changed around in new and interesting ways. Also, There is a little glass mechanical horse that is animated that runs around and helps her with things, and I'm just so much in love with him, and if that was something that could be a thing, I would want it to be a thing. This is the first in a series. I'm not sure how many books are going to be in it yet, but the next book does come out on August 1st of this year, and I'm very interested about it because this book definitely makes it clear that there is a war brewing between the Fae and the non-Fae, and it sounds like the second book is going to explore that, and I think it's actually that war is going to hit. So I'm nervous for all the characters in the story that make it through, for what's going to come next for them, but I'm very fascinated to see how it will play out. The next book I read was Emily in the Hollow World by Martha Wells. This is another steampunk YA book. This was just fun, adventure. This was a Strange Chemistry publication, which Strange Chemistry unfortunately is no longer in business, but their books have been picked up by other publishers. And I have to say, if you ever have a chance to read a Strange Chemistry book, definitely pick it up. So far, every single one I've read, I've really enjoyed. I gave this one 4 very solid stars. Their characters are unforgettable, and the worlds are a lot of fun. They're very fast-paced, very easy reads. Emily in the Hollow World follows Emily. She's a very young protagonist. She just loves adventure. She can't wait to get out there, and kind of jumps the gun a little bit. You definitely see her naivete play into her making some poor choices and poor decisions. So it definitely is not one of these, oh, look, it's a 12-year-old who already knows how to navigate around the world and all these tough adult situations. No, you definitely see her struggle with her lack of knowledge about things, and sort of gets her into trouble. There are airships in here, but instead of going up into the sky, we go down into the center of the earth. That's right, there is a whole secret world inside the planet, thus the Hollow World, which was very fascinating. It was super exciting. Got to meet a lot of different species and characters. At the same time, she's, making friends with these people on the ship. There's this woman who is a single woman, and she's an adventurer, and Emily is just completely enamored by her because in her limited world she's never gotten the impression that a woman can be anything more than a wife, a mother, or a whore. So she is just dazzled by this woman who has gone off on her way. She shoots guns, and someone kind of takes her under her wing a little bit, and it's just a lot of fun to see happen. So I definitely recommend this if you just want a fun afternoon going on an adventure with a very spunky, young, adorable, lovable main character. I had a lot of fun with this one. The next book I read was The Unwritten Volume 9. This is called Fables. This is the 9th volume in the Unwritten series. I gave this one 3 stars. I really didn't enjoy this as much as being an installment of the series. It certainly felt like we were breaking away from the main story, kind of like we were taking a little intermission from it, which I don't understand because I liked the main story that's going on. I didn't want to take a break from it. It's the second time in the series that has happened with one of these volumes. I didn't like the other volume very much either. That kind of felt like it was taking a break. The Unwritten, the series in general, basically you've got our main character, Tom Tayler. His father wrote a wildly popular and successful series of books about a character named Tommy Tayler, who does magic with a wand, and his 2 best friends are a boy and a girl who also do magic with wands. They go to a magic school to learn how to do their magic. Sound familiar, anybody? Yeah, it's not a very cleverly disguised reinterpretation of the Harry Potter story. However, there are a lot of people in the Unwritten world who are fans of the Tommy Tayler series, and they believe that the author's son, Tom Tayler, is the actual Tommy Tayler. Like, he can do magic and everything. Tom Tayler does not buy into this. He's like, hi, they were just books. I'm a normal person, and magic isn't real. Obviously, as you can guess, that's not necessarily the case. There is magic, however. It's magic that's tied into stories and books, and the more popular and well-read and more classic the story, the stronger the magic and power of that story is. And if there is enough power given to characters in those stories, they can actually manifest in reality. and affect the real world based off of their magic from that story. So obviously, definitely in my wheelhouse of ideas that I love reading about. So I haven't seen anybody else talk about the Unwritten series on BookTube, and I don't know why, because this is like a series for book lovers. So I would highly recommend it. This one, Volume 9, it's basically sort of a spin-off. It brings in a lot of the characters from the Fables graphic novel series. So if you're really into the Fables series, which I haven't read yet, I think you might get a lot more out of this. It was interesting for me. I mean, there's still a story that takes place in this one. There's, a group of fables. They're hiding from the Stark Lord, who's trying to wipe them out. And so there's a lot of tension and action, and there's some battles through that. And that was interesting. We see some development of some of the Fables characters, some background history to them. So I just think that because I didn't have the background of the Fables, or I was really looking for the next installment to the Unwritten story, I was a little bit disappointed by this. Also, the ending, super confusing. Like, I don't understand the whole point of that ending to the story in this volume, and I really don't see how the series can continue, although it obviously does because there are more volumes. So I'm really confused by it and disappointed. I gave it a 3 stars just because I did like hanging out with Tom Taylor again, and I liked some of the things that happened with the Fables characters in this story. The artwork was still great, but I don't know. I don't know. On the whole, I hope that we pick back up with the regular story in the next volume, though I don't know how that's possible. Alright, then I read Who Fears Death by Nnedi Okorafor. This is a magical realism book. This is an Own Voices book. It was written by an African American, and I loved seeing the fresh perspective on sort of magical realism, shape-changing. I've read a ton of shape-changing books, shape-shifting books, but a lot of them really seem to have sort of a very whitewashed European, Northern European interpretation on it. And so even though it's this fantastical, magical, made-up thing, they're all kind of told in the same way. And Who Fears Death, shape-shifting, is handled very, very differently. I really enjoyed the way it was described, like how the characters who could shapeshift, how they did it, what happened to them. Also, it wasn't just, oh, look, this nifty cool thing that happens. There's a very real threat to the individual who shapeshifts, that if they stay in one form for too long, the form of that animal can actually begin to take over their personality, and there's a risk that they may never change back, or that when they change back they are less human and more animal. And so there's definitely a delicate balance that happens. Our main character in this book, she is the product of rape. Her mother was one of the only surviving women of a village that was raped by a rival village, if you will, and her mother sort of becomes an outcast because obviously she becomes pregnant, and that's like a constant reminder of the fact that this warring village sort of conquered them. And so she just wanders out in the desert by herself. She has her daughter by herself, kind of raises her, and the story sort of takes off from there. So our main character, she has all this immense, incredible power, but women aren't really trained to be sorcerers or magicians. I can't remember what the term is that they use in here for that. So she wants to develop her power. Obviously her mother is a very strong figure, so she believes that she, deserves to learn about this power, but at the same time, underneath the surface, she's very unsure, and her confidence does struggle a little bit because she can't help but be constantly reminded of the fact that she is a product of rape. She does bring shame to her family, and she's trying to come up with a way to overcome that. I just can't say enough about this story. Yes, there are obviously some very tough, heartbreaking things that happen in here, but the magic is just so new to me. You get pulled into the world. This is a very atmospheric book. You're out in the desert. and you meet all these interesting different cultures and how these different tribes work with each other. And really, it's all just these people trying to be people and trying to find their own identity and just get along. There's also, an adventure and sort of this quest in that it becomes pretty apparent that there is a powerful sorcerer out there who is trying to destroy her. Even before really she's developed her own magic and abilities, he sort of catches wind of it and is out to destroy her. And he has his own reasons for that, which I won't give away here. But it does add a whole interesting different twist to this. Highly recommend this if you haven't picked up any of Nadia Okorafor's books. They are books that will grab you, drag you in, and won't let you go until you're done with them. So I definitely recommend this one. It was a very solid 5 stars for me. I would have given it more stars if I could have. Then I read Dragons and Unicorns by Paul and Karen Youngsgaard. This was actually a reread for me. This is just a fun little book. It's sort of written as if it were a research manual or a topical guide to dragons and unicorns, if such things were real. I read this back in college to get some ideas for a paper I actually wrote about the history of unicorns and how they are explored in different cultures. This was a lot of fun. Like I said, it was a reread for me. I actually had more fun kind of coming across some of my old notes that were in here and just revisiting how different areas of the world describe or tell stories about dragons and unicorns. Again, kind of getting that broader perspective on mythical creatures that a lot of times we only see explained from one cultural perspective, and this gave us some different ones. So this was a solid 3. I'm glad that I picked it up and reread it. There was a lot of stuff I had forgotten about it, and it was fun to revisit it. Then I jumped into the Libriomancer world. You may remember the first book, Libriomancer, I read in May and really enjoyed it, and it was time for me to go back to the series, and by now I've finished the series. So I read Codex Born, which is the second book in the, I'm going to call it the Libriomancer series. It's actually called the Magic Ex Libris series. It's Latin. I don't speak Latin, so I'm sure I butchered that pronunciation. This is written by Jim C. Hines. You'll notice I only have the dust jacket because I am loaning this second book out to my roommate. She's also reading the series and really enjoying it. Libriomancers, if you haven't watched my May wrap-up video, basically they are individuals who can open up a book and they can reach into the book and pull things out of the book and make it real. The main character, Isaac, he is a Libriomancer. He is part of the Porters, which is basically a group of Libriomancers kind of in charge of policing the other magic. Kind of think the Ministry of Magic in the Harry Potter world, but on a much, much smaller scale. So he works for the Porters. In this book, we are back with Isaac and sort of his friends and people that he works with. This book centers around the theme of history is always told by the victors. We explore that through a new group of individuals who we meet, who to them, the Porters and Gutenberg, who's in charge of the Porters, is the enemy, and he's a very scary enemy, and not even like they're out to try and destroy him. They're just trying to hide from them. They're terrified of them. And Isaac, our main character, he is a Porter, so this does something very interesting in that these group of people who in the first book you're led to believe, okay, these are the good guys, blah, 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 we always need to root for them. Suddenly, when you hear the history told from this other group's perspective, you're kind of like, yeah, I would be afraid of them too. And now you're not so sure that they are the good guys. And you can see that historical events really can have two very different interpretations and be told two very different ways. And Isaac also struggles with this as he learns more. And I mean, how tough is it for the reader to find that these people you've been rooting for, thinking are the good guys, aren't? But imagine if you were one of those people going on in your life and thinking, yeah, I'm fighting the good fight, I'm doing what's right, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh crap, the people who came before me, they did this terrible, horrible thing, and I can't really blame these other individuals for being afraid of us. And of course, to complicate that, there is a bigger enemy, and the Porters and this new group really can't take down this enemy on their own. They're actually going to need help, and that help is that they're going to have to work together. So I just thought that was so interesting. I loved seeing it being explored in here. It was a lot of depth that I think people may not necessarily expect from these books on the surface. They just look like fun little adventure books. It is fun, don't get me wrong. I love the characters in here. I love how they were being developed. I also like that in this book, the concept of e-readers was introduced. There's actually a character who she can do the same magic the Libriomancers do with, physical books, only she can do it with an e-reader. So it made the story feel very modern. It was very interesting because they don't necessarily cross over. Like, she can't really do the magic with physical books, and all the Libriomancers who can do crazy psychotic magic with physical books, they pick up an e-reader and it's just touching a screen. It doesn't do anything for them. So we got to see the magic expanded a little bit. Then, I don't have a copy of it because I read it on my e-reader, but there was a novella in the Libriomancer world called Chupacabra Song, also by Jim C. Hines. This is a prequel by far. It takes place about 20 years before Libriomancer happens. It actually follows Nicola, who in the Libriomancer books, the full books, she's already a very solid member of the Porters. She's actually one of the most powerful Porters, Libriomancers out there. Her magic actually can sort of override some of the Libriomancers that are set up as being, super powerful. Chupacabra Song actually brings us to when Nicola was a child and her powers were just starting to develop. And her magic is done more through song and singing and humming to herself. She's also autistic. It's not really said, and a big deal is not made about it, but if you've read about other autistic characters, or you know someone with autism, or you just know how that condition can sort of play out, it's very obvious reading about it that that's what she is. And I'm just so impressed that Jim Hines was not afraid to take a character who has something like autism, not make that be the big crucial point of their character, just that's another piece, it's another component of their character, but then to take that and they're actually one of the most powerful of the magic users in this world. It was very interesting and fascinating to read. It's called Chupacabra Song because chupacabras are in this book. Nicola, she actually raises them. She has quite a few as pets and she loves them. I think she actually loves them more than the people that she has to deal with. So this just sort of shows how she discovers chupacabras and her special relationship with them. And it's a very, very short novella. I gave it 5 stars. It was amazing. I could have read a whole book just about Nicola. I don't think it really spoils any of the books. You could kind of read that whenever you wanted. If you wanted to get a very brief taste of the world, I definitely suggest it. I would, however, suggest that you read Chupacabra Song before the 4th and final book in the Magic X Race series. Not that I think you would miss anything if you didn't read it. It gives more background to Nicola, and she kind of comes into play in the 4th book. In a way that it just gives more depth to her if you have read it. It's a short novella. You don't have to read it. You could just skip it. But why not have that extra layer of flavor? You know what I mean? Once that was done, then another thing I forgot to say about Codex Born, the 2nd book. I hated the ending. The ending pissed me off. It frustrated me. I didn't see it coming. I didn't like what was happening. It made me very angry at some of the characters in this book. And thank goodness I had more books, because otherwise it could have upset me so much that I wouldn't have continued with the series, and that would be a mistake. So as you're going along in the series, if you read this book and you get to that ending and you're just like, what? Hang in there. Just pick up the next book and keep going. The next book being Unbound. So this is the 3rd book in the Magic X Libris series. This one we see Isaac, our main character. He's still alive, God bless him. he has to come up with different ways of solving his problems. And that's all I'll really say. As we get further into the series, it gets tougher for me to not spoil things. He is also very obviously suffering from depression in this book as a result of what happens in the second book. So I like that the author is taking consequences of events that happen in one book and he's pulling them over into subsequent books, and it makes the characters feel more real. It makes this world feel more real, that hey, just because a book ends doesn't mean that all the problems and consequences of the events in that book ended. They have ongoing long-term effects and ramifications. This one, basically, we're just seeing that struggle between the Porters, the new group of individuals we've met in the second book, and the bigger threat. Sort of those three have all come to a head, and they're all at odds with each other. I think all of them eventually end up not liking Isaac and going after him. Poor guy. This was a dark book to read. It was a very tough book to read. Jim Hines does do a good job of adding in some comic relief in here. It was also really interesting to see Isaac and Lena and Nadie, who are two other characters in this book. They've kind of been palling around through the whole series. See the depth to their interactions and how their relationships with each other really evolve and develop. I can't say more than that without kind of spoiling what goes on, but every book these characters just get more and more rich and developed. Very strong Harry Dresden vibes from this book as well. If you've ever read any of the Harry Dresden books by Jim Butcher, you'll definitely recognize a lot of vibes in here. Not so much that he's copying, but just sort of this dark, not really an anti-hero, but just this guy who wants to do the right thing and be the right guy, and it just seems like the world is conspiring against him to make that happen. I flew through this one. A better ending to this one than the last book, but again, it does kind of leave some things hanging there. There's a very tough thing that happens at the end of this book, and so you just kind of like, each of these books you kind of like, oh, but then, oh, how is this going to work out? So they're very addicting, as you can tell. And the final book that I finished in June, I don't have a copy of it with me. I actually listened to this one on audio. It was Age of Myth by Michael J. Sullivan. Michael Sullivan wrote the Rhaenyra books, the Rhaenyra Chronicles and the Rhaenyra Revelations. Each of those series is 3 books. Age of Myth is the beginning of a new series that actually takes place thousands of years before those Rhaenyra books do. So it's not the same characters, it's going to be totally different. The audiobook is done by the same narrator who narrated all of the Rhaenyra books. I gave this book a 5 stars. I highly recommend the audiobooks. If you haven't read any of Michael Sullivan's books, he tends to have a mixture of names that are very familiar and then very unfamiliar names. And Age of Myth, there's a lot of unfamiliar names. I took a look at some of the printing of those names, and it was just, I would have no idea how to pronounce them if I hadn't listened to the audiobook. And that's okay every once in a while in a book, and it does happen a lot in fantasy books, but I think trying to read through it, not knowing how to pronounce all these different names, it could have gotten a little confusing for me. And so I enjoyed having the audiobook where I didn't have to worry about the pronunciation. I could just listen to the story. There's way more magic in this than in the Rhaenyra books, which was great. I think part of what I liked so much about the Rhaenyra books was the interplay between Royce and Hadrian, the 2 main characters. In Age of Myth, you're sort of getting that, but with more characters. Our band of heroes, as I like to think of them, is bigger than that, and that just makes for more fun interactions between them. Also, the group's mystic, she's pretty powerful. She's also a child, and her best friend is a wolf, which is just so much fun. This book was a lot of fun. I listened to it with my roommate when we were carpooling, and the second book, Age of Swords, actually is supposed to come out at the end of July, so I'm definitely looking forward to that. I'm sure we will fly through that as well. If you haven't picked up any of Michael Sullivan's works, I highly recommend him. He does very great high fantasy writing, and I think part of what makes it so great is his characters and how they interact with each other. There's a lot of fun, witty banter between them, and he's really good at crafting long-arching stories in his books. So, 10 million years later, those are the books that I read in July. It was 16 books. I think it's been a couple of years since I've read that many books in 1 month. I kind of can't believe I did it. I think part of what I attribute that success to was the Read-A-Rama readathon that happened very early on in June. I definitely read, I think, almost half of the books during that point in time. So, let's see if I can lift these up now, showing you the spines. These are all the books, plus an ebook and an audiobook that I read in June. It was a great reading month for me. I do not think I'm going to read that many in July, but well, you never know. I got a lot of good things lined up for July to get to. If you stayed all the way until the end, oh my goodness, thank you so much. To let me know you watched all the way to the end, why don't you comment Libriomancer down below, and I would just be so flattered and overwhelmed that you actually made it to the end. What did you read last month? Did you do a wrap-up video for June? I'd love to watch it. Feel free to leave a link to your video of your June wrap-up in the comments below, and I'll go take a look at it. I will see you next time. Bye!